During this pandemic, I have been sharing with you how Jesus Christ wants to do an inner work in our hearts so that our outer life conforms to the quality of our inner life. Because whatever the condition I have in my innermost being, that is going to be reflected in my outer circumstances. Many a time, if I see problem outside of my life or outside of my heart, it could be a reflection of the condition of my inner heart. If I always have misunderstanding with other people, the problem may not be with the people, problem may be with me. If I'm always suffering with some kind of miserable failure or some problem is happening outside there, maybe it is a reflection of some kind of chaotic life I may have in the inside. But today I want to draw your attention to a different question. That is, yes, the world is full of problems and difficulties. Life is a tragedy. A Canadian scholar, a psychologist, he always says life is a tragedy. Life itself is a tragedy. So, how can we make sense in this tragic world with this tragic life? Sometime, a few days ago, you see, people went into the church to worship, to pray, and some maniac walks into the church and decapitates one and kills the two others. Now, some of them were, one of them, 40-plus-year-old, beautiful woman with some children, with the future hope of starting a restaurant, goes to early in the morning church to pray, and she gets stabbed to death. How about her children now? How about her husband and family? Now, it may sound so far away to a distant land, but tragedy can be waiting for us the next door as well. At any time, life can turn upside down. So, in this tragic world, in a world where there is everything uncertain, how can we believe in a God? How can we make sense of a good and a loving and a kind God when my own life goes through all these kind of unbearable tragedies? Can I still believe in God when my life is under this unbearable load or heaviness, filled with fear, anxiety, depression, worry? How can I still believe in God? Or what kind of God should I believe? How can I make sense of my faith in God when my life goes through these kind of difficulties? Now, every one of us knows there is a God. You look at the beautiful creation, you know there is a God. You look in your own conscience and you know there must be a God. But those pictures that we see about God from nature and conscience were not sufficient for us to introduce a God that we can still believe when, even though our lives are going through some kind of tragedies. So therefore, this God finally made himself revealed to us in the person of Jesus Christ. Or the Word of God is the final mirror in which we see the face of God. The Bible is the window from which we see who God is. And even though life may be going through tragedy, if we look to God through the window of the Bible, we see a picture of God that gives us reason to believe, even though our natural mind says it is useless to believe in God. So what kind of God should we have, or how can we believe in God when life is going through tragedy and difficulty and meaninglessness? I want to point out to three things that will help us to steady our ship in the midst of a raging sea. When your boat is shaken by the waves and the wind and the storms, what will steady your boat of faith or the boat of life in the raging sea? Three pictures of God that the Bible gives us. As a believer, we need to have that picture in our mind. See, if you're a student at school, if you don't know mathematical formulas, life becomes miserable. How do I know? Because I come from that kind of a situation. I never knew how to solve a math problem. But as for other student who knows the formula, for them it is nothing. It doesn't bother. But for me, it was a miserable experience. All my life in the school, I had a miserable time with math because I just couldn't understand. So not to know sometimes can bring you into a terrible place of misery. In the same way, not to see this picture of God can make your life very difficult to live in the midst of challenges. But if you know the mathematical formula, you know the answer. You already know the answer. In the same way, when you read the Bible and when you see these three pictures of God, it will help you to make sense of your life, to make sense of your faith in that God. Other people may make fun of you, but you know why you believe in a God in a time like that. So first of all, if you want to see meaning in your life, and if you want to continue to believe in this God, even though your life is going through a hard time, if you want to still love this God, even though in your life everything is turning upside down, number one, let us read Ephesians chapter 1 verse 4-5. Those places we see, we believe in a God who has preordained our life. We believe in a God who predestined our life. The predestination work of God is many times misunderstood, and many Christians don't think about it. And some Christians, they only think about predestination and then they stop living from their perspective or their responsibility. They just abdicate everything. Oh, everything is will of God, everything will of God. So if I want to make sense of my life when I go through the hardships and difficulties, number one, I must believe in God's predestinating work. Let us read Ephesians chapter 1 verse 4 and 5. My English translation always bothers me here when I change the version. Okay, here it says, For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will. A believer ought to live in confident belief that my life has been ordained by God. Today, I am here in this city at this time, in this church, at this fellowship. I was born in this family. I am this and this. I am man or woman. I am this tall or this short. Everything has happened to me not by accident, but because there is a God who has ordained my life. How he say, in love he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will. And continue in verse 11 and 12. In him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will, in order that we who were the first to put our hope in Christ might be for the praise of his glory. So the first thing I want you to think about your faith in God, or what kind of God do you believe, or how can you make sense of your life when life makes no sense? How could you still believe in God when life is falling apart? Number one, I believe in a God who has ordained my life before the foundation of the world. Before creation itself, I was in the mind of God. Before He made the universe, we were in the mind of God. The Bible talks about a God who has ordained our every step. If you can believe God like that, if you look at God like that, then what happens? In loving predestination, you find courage to accept whatever may not be as loving in this present life. Maybe something is so challenging. Maybe you're losing something. Today, this morning, I was reading a story about a great woman from Chennai. In 72, she married. She said she comes from a very well-to-do family. 25 proposals came from very well-to-do people for her marriage. She refused. 26th came from a man who was a veterinarian, yet a missionary among a tribal group in the jungles somewhere in Chennai. She wanted to worship God. She wanted to serve God in her life, and she accepted this humble man's proposal. They married, had 4 children, husband and wife. She also herself a medical doctor, began to serve in jungles to these tribal groups. But in 1986, husband developed kidney failure. While he was on the operating table in Chennai, he died, leaving a wife and 4 children. Many of her family and friends told her not to go back to the jungle, but begin to practice her medicine in Chennai so that she can live a comfortable life. She said, "How can I do that? God called us to minister. We believed in God's preordained plan. If I wanted to make a good life and money and practice my medicine in the city, I would not have chosen to marry my husband. I believe in a sovereign plan of God." So after burying her husband, 9 days later, she takes her 4 children, goes back to the jungles. From 86 until today, she lives in that jungle. She is now 76 plus old woman, and she herself got contracted with coronavirus. And she said, even in this time of quarantine, I can still hear the voice of God saying me, "Be still and know that I am God and I have ordained every single day for you." Let us go to Psalm 139 verse, Psalm 139 verse 15, 16 and 17. We believe in a God who not only ordained us before the creation of the world. Look at the whole chapter talks about God's predestination. Here it says, Psalm 139 verse 15, "My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth." He's talking about mother's womb. "Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count," and he goes on to describe the loving hand of God weaving together a body in a mother's womb, bringing out not only for a life, but for every single day. How many days on earth are ordained for me? You wrote them in your book, O God. So when life goes through tough time and difficult times, if you have a picture of God who ordains everything according to His will and purpose, and your own life is also His handiwork, His artwork, He made it the way you are today. Whatever the look you have, whatever the family you are born in, whatever the nations you are staying in, whatever the kind of job, to whom you may be married, whether or not married, all of them come within this loving and foreordaining plan of God. And therefore, like this lady in Chennai, if you accept this divine sovereign plan of God, you can still believe God. You can still love God with all of your heart. Now, the second thing, I could go on to different parts where we talk about God's preordination, predestination. But now, when we say God predestined everything, that means it doesn't mean that God made us like automated machines and He planned everything according to His foreordained will. Now, everything will go so that God doesn't need to work in our life. In other words, like a watch, a watchmaker makes the watch and he sends it to the market and the watch will continue to run. Sometimes people think predestination like that. We don't know the whole picture of God's predestinating plan. But one thing we know, whatever has happened to us has happened because God ordained it. Now, He not only ordained it, but He is still working in our life. The second picture of God we have to have in our mind is that whatever is happening to me is happening in the providence of God. That means God is working everything for my good. That is another picture. Preordained, predestined. Okay, maybe my life is fixed or what? No, our lives are not yet fixed. It's a mystery. Even though God has ordained certain things, but God is still working in my life. He hasn't forgotten me. Romans 8:27, the famous verse some of you already know. Romans 8:28. It says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. In the same chapter below, he talks about predestination also. That means everything that is happening to us, in the midst of those things, God is still working for us. So we have to believe in the goodness of God. We have to believe in predestination of God. Then we have to believe in the providence of God. In other words, we have to believe in the goodness of God. Whatever is happening to me is happening for my benefit. Somewhere, somehow, God is working on my behalf. So maybe your life is not as beautiful as you wish it to be. Maybe your life is not as comfortable as you wanted it to be. But yet, behind the scene, God is working for your good. So we believe in a God who is working everything for our good. Maybe some people are attacking you. Even at that point, we ought to believe in this divine hand that is working on our behalf. God is working everything for my good. Never doubt the power of God to turn your adverse situation for your benefit. So much so, I always tell, God is able to use your own mistakes for your benefit. If you turn to God, if you believe in the goodness of God. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 6, when we come to God, we must come with that kind of a faith that He is for me, not against me. Oftentimes we have presented a picture of a God who is so terrible, who is so threatening, that we have to live in fear of God constantly. We have to make sure that we are walking aright. No. I read a Bible in which I see a loving God, just like I'm a father, my wife is a mother. There were times when our son used to make mistake. We may be upset for a while, but we were never angry. We would never curse our son. We would never wish evil for him. We always wished good for him. And even though he made a mistake, we would always think about how to help him to see that his mistakes are not good. So, if a human father thinks like that, how much more a loving father? So, he has this ability to turn your misery for your benefit, and eventually you will come out of it. That undying faith in the goodness of God, that God is working everything for my good. That is the second picture we need to have in our life. If you miss this one, then life becomes unlivable. You become bitter and filled with anger. Everyone who comes against you, everyone who talks bad about you, everyone who offends you, everything that is not going according to your will and purpose makes you more miserable. But if you believe in the goodness of God, when a human being is abusing you, you can still look at that person and go beyond that person, see the hand of God behind. And God is able to bring good out of every evil circumstances. Let me just give one example of how God uses evil thing for our good. Genesis chapter 50, the last chapter, Genesis. You know the story of Joseph. Let me read verse 19 and 20. Joseph had a beautiful dream in which he saw him being lifted up by God, where his parents would come and bow down to him, his brothers would come and bow down to him. But his brothers were evil, so they wanted to kill him. They threw him in the pit. Then they said, what is the point of killing him? There is no benefit. Let us sell him for 20 shekels or 20 pieces of silver. They sold him to Egypt as a slave, their own brother. They wanted to kill, and finally they sold him. He goes to Egypt and he begins to work in this officer's house, where the officer's wife had evil sight. She wanted to trip him in his morality. And he says to her, how can I sin against God? A young man, a wife is tempting him, and he says, how can I sin against God? Joseph, even though when he was in pit, I don't think he forgot that the predestination. Okay, think about predestination. God has a plan for my life. He knew, I will one day, I will not die in this pit. My brothers may live and go, but I will still live. Then they sold him and they tied him and took him to Egypt. Along the way, in the back of his head, he had this predestination plan of God, predestined plan of God. And therefore, instead of being bitter against his brother, Joseph seems to be looking to God, always say, God, I thank you. You are doing something amazing. You have a plan for my life. I know my brothers wanted to kill me, but you have a plan to give me life. I know my brothers have sold me as a slave. You have a plan to lift me up. Now this woman has accused him of raping her and he is sent into prison. The Bible says God was with Joseph. In prison, Joseph becomes successful. If you're a bitter person, unhappy person, you can never be successful in anywhere you go. But Joseph becomes a manager in prison. And eventually, we know the story. God lifted him from prison, put him in the prime minister's position, and he becomes the ruler next to the emperor. And that's when the brothers have come, parents have come, they have bowed down to him. He's a powerful man now. And when Jacob died, these wicked brothers still couldn't believe that Joseph was a righteous man. They were still afraid that he's going to take revenge because our father has died. So they come to him in verse 19. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? They were kind of manipulating him in protecting their life and say, am I God to punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. In this translation, you intended to harm me, God intended to use your evil schemes to lift me up. So Joseph was able to objectively accept the evil things in his life because he saw the good hand of God working through his wicked brother's hand. How can we make sense of our life when life is miserable? Because we believe in a God who can turn our misery into our rejoicing. That's the kind of faith I want to see in all of our lives. Thirdly, God not only predestines us, God not only works in everything for our benefit, God also has given us the responsibility, not the responsibility, I would say a privilege to take part in the construction of our life. God is a creator. I just wrote a blog post yesterday that we should not live our life with the idea of all or nothing. In other words, some people who reject God completely, they want to live on their own. Some people who believe in God, they want to give up their responsibility and everything they hand it over to God. That's not how Bible talks about God. God is a co-worker with us. God has given us the privilege of constructing some parts of our life in hand with Him. That is, we believe in a God who answers our prayer. We believe in a God who changes His mind in response to our prayer. Now, this is a deep theological question. Does God change His mind? People may split their hairs, but we don't need to do that. We want to live a life that glorifies God. We want to live a life that finds meaning in the midst of meaninglessness. We want to live a life that is worth living. How can we do that? Number one, we believe in a God who predestines us. We are here because He planned us. Secondly, we believe in a God who can change my circumstances, no matter how bad they may be, for my good. Thirdly, we believe in a God who has given me the responsibility and the opportunity to take part in how I want my life. So He answers my prayer. For example, if I evaluate my life and I'm not happy with certain things in my life, I want to change, and I say to God, Lord, this part of my life, I'm not happy. I want to see something better in this part. So I ask Him and He answers my prayer. We believe in a God who answers our prayer. And because of His willingness to answer our prayer, we are becoming co-creator with God. You can create the kind of life you want, in other words. Matthew chapter 7, verse 7 to 11. I will read one or two verses and then I'll close. Matthew 7:7 was a verse that stuck to my head when I first came to Christ. Matthew 7:7. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds. And the one who knocks, the door will be opened. And then he goes on to say, you are wicked human being, but still you love to give good gifts to your children. In verse 11, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask from Him? So we believe in a God who answers our prayer. So if I'm going through hard times, I have the privilege of going to God and say, Lord, this is bothering me. I need your help in this time. And I believe that He is going to answer my prayer. James, the brother of Jesus, said, you don't have because you don't ask. And sometimes when you ask with the wrong kind of desires to fulfill your lust. But no, we want to live a God-glorifying life. To make my life God-glorifying, there are certain things I need. I need enough food to eat. I need clothes to cover my body. I need a shelter to stay. I need some extra money to take care of my children, my family. Jesus very clearly said when He taught us to pray, Father, give us our daily bread. God knows we need daily bread. We need to ask, what do you need? In John chapter 15, verse 7, Jesus beautifully said, if you remain in me and my words remain in you, then ask whatever you desire. I believe in a God, or I see a God in the Bible that is not only interested in supplying my needs, He is also interested in supplying my wishes. That's a beautiful picture of God. He clearly, in many different places in the Bible, it says, ask whatever you desire, and it shall be done. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will fulfill the desires of your heart. That is a loving, kind, compassionate Father. So if you have this picture of God who has ordained your life, predestined you before the foundations of the world, and then He is still working for your good, no matter how bad the life or situation may have become. And then thirdly, you see a God who is delighted to answer your prayer. Every time you run to Him, He is so excited to listen to you, to hear. And sometimes when you pray, your prayer is not answered. There is no answer to your prayer. Then you don't become discouraged. You know a God who has preordained your life. So He must be working something behind the scene. He knows what is good for me because my days are numbered and written in the book of life. And then I believe also in a God who is working behind the scene. I may not know why God is not answering right now, but I know God is going to do what is best for me. That's when life becomes worth living and God becomes worth believing. Not only worth believing, this life becomes a joyride, even though we may be going through a painful situation.